The medieval English warbow archer, the longbowman, one of the most famous types of soldier of the late Middle Ages. And as we've looked at recently, their primary job obviously was to shoot arrows at the enemy, but they also were very important in hand-to-hand combat. They were pretty much always armed with at least swords, very often axes or hatchets, which are mentioned in the sources. And intriguingly, there's mention of mauls, possibly lead mauls, which we've looked at in a recent video. But while they were incredibly important as missile troops, and probably almost equally important as hand-to-hand combat troops, there's one absolutely intrinsic and vital part of their armoury which often gets overlooked: the wooden stake. So in this video we're going to be looking at the importance of the wooden stake to the archer, where it came from and how they were used. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now most of you probably will have heard that medieval English archers used wooden stakes, but do you know what? I've never tried to make one, so luckily I've got a garden with lots of trees in it and I had one which needed taking down. So I have taken down a small tree here of the type that archers would have perhaps had to harvest on campaign in France or wherever they happened to be at the time, sometimes in England. And I'm going to turn this into a wooden stake as described in the sources. That is about the same height as a person, I'm 6'1", and sharpened at both ends. Then we're going to look at why these were so important, where they possibly came from, because that might surprise you, and how they were used. So here we have it. Obviously we don't know an awful lot about these wooden stakes, but that is a stake of roughly the same height as me, pointed now pretty roughly. I am no carpenter, at both ends. That end is obviously going to go into the ground, the heavier end, because that'll be more stable, and therefore I've made this end, which will be pointing outwards, a little bit more pointy. And as I know some people will ask, could you at a push use this as a weapon in its own right? And the answer is yes. It's essentially not that dissimilar to a Godendag. Now I've chosen a fairly big stake, a fairly rough thing. You could of course choose a thinner one, but absolutely against horses or fallen knights, absolutely you could use this as a giant cudgel. And in fact we do see giant cudgels used in the treatise by Paulus Hector Meyer, for example. And you might think that something as simple as this actually went back a long way. Well, it didn't necessarily, and in fact as far as English battle tactics were concerned, it was an innovation of Henry V. So now let's look at the historical context. Where did these come from and how were they used? It doesn't matter what kind of sport or activity you're doing, whether you're training martial arts or whether you're going for a run. Or maybe you're just out for a bike ride, but you want to be able to hear the traffic and hear people around you. Perhaps keep track of where your dog is. But you want to keep up with your music or your latest podcast that you're listening to or audiobook, but you still want to be able to hear through your ears. So this video today is sponsored by Raycon, and you can keep your ears open and your playlists rolling while you use Raycon's bone conduction headphones. In fact, these Raycon bone conduction headphones here have been so useful in the last couple of weeks because my kids have been on school holidays, and it means that I've been able to be out here in my garage doing cleaning and restoration and preparation of stock for my website and other work, cleaning around the house and stuff, while still being able to keep an ear out for what the kids are actually getting up to. So the real secret behind Raycon's bone conduction headphones here is that they send vibrations through your bones, keeping your ear holes open, which is great for general awareness and safety. They've got a whopping 13 hours of battery life, as well as being IP68 waterproof and dustproof. And while these are premium quality, they're not premium priced. They're perfectly affordable. So look, you probably realise that Black Friday is around the corner, and Raycon's audio products are up to 30% off. From everyday essentials to the latest releases, it's the perfect time to upgrade your sound or get ahead on gifting for Christmas. And these early deals aren't going to last long, so get in there now while you can before they're gone. So look, you can help support the channel, but you can also help yourself by getting some great deals, clicking on the link in the description box down below, or you can go to buyraycon.com/ScholaBC, which is my special code, only during Raycon's Black Friday and Cyber Monday sale. So thanks for sticking with me. Now back to this blooming great stake. I absolutely love it. It's a club, it's a wooden stake, it keeps horses away. So I think a lot of people who've read about English longbowmen, particularly the Battle of Agincourt, take wooden stakes for granted. They kind of assume that wooden stakes have always been around where longbowmen have been around. And in fact, that's not true. That's not the case. This was, as far as English military history is concerned, an invention of Henry V. So I guess the question is, why did Henry V introduce these, and where did he get the idea from? Well, the answer might surprise some of you, in fact, because the possible answer is the Turks, the Ottomans, the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. Now, funnily enough, there are at least two direct connecting points between Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt and the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. So bear in mind that the Battle of Agincourt is the very first time when we categorically know that English archers used wooden stakes to defend their position and shoot from behind or within. We'll get into the kind of formation and the deployment of the stakes in a minute. But just about the origin. So in 1396, the Battle of Nicopolis was fought between the Ottomans and European forces. And at that battle, the Turks made extensive and rather famous use of wooden stakes. Now, in fact, many people will know that Marshal Boucicaut was one of the commanders of the French army at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, and he himself had been at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. In fact, he'd been captured by the Turks and eventually was ransomed back. Ironically, he would go on to also be captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. He wasn't having a good time really in this period, but Marshal Boucicaut was one of the most famous knights of his time. In fact, he fought 2 duels against a certain Galeazzo de Mantova, who was a student of a certain Fiore de Liberi, one of the people whose treatises I actually work from and teach. So there is connecting tissue between all of these people. So not only was Marshal Boucicaut at the Battle of Nicopolis, but Marshal Boucicaut famously developed what's sometimes known as the Somme Plan, which was a strategy to defeat the English army in the field by the French army. Now, it's possible, did this get leaked? Was knowledge of this plan known to the English somehow? Who knows? But an order went through Henry V to his army thus. It said, the enemy command had assigned certain squadrons of cavalry, many hundreds strong and mounted on barded horses, to break the formation and resist our archers when they engaged us in battle. The king, therefore, had it proclaimed throughout the army that every archer was to prepare and fashion for himself a stake or staff, the Latin is unum palum vel baculum, either square or round, but 6 feet long, as my massive great stake now is, of sufficient thickness, to resist horses that is, and sharpened at both ends, as mine is. And he commanded that whenever the French army drew near to do battle and to break their ranks by such columns of horse, all the archers were to drive their stakes in front of them in line abreast, and then some of them should do this further back and in between. One end being driven into the ground pointing down towards themselves, and in other words towards the ground towards you, so the other end's pointing outwards, the other end pointing up towards the enemy above waist height, so that the cavalry, when their charger brought them close and in sight of stakes, would either withdraw in great fear or reckless of their own safety, run the risk of having both the horses and the riders impaled. Now, in fact, although this is widely seen as an anti-cavalry tactic, in fact, at the Battle of Nicopolis, it also impeded the infantry advance as well, so much so that the Ottoman army under Bayezid I, the European forces, I'll loosely call them, they were mostly French and Burgundian knights, some German, some English, who came up. They actually had to remove the stakes in order to advance on the Ottoman Turkish infantry. So not only were they an impediment to horse charges, but they were also an impediment to just anybody else trying to get past. Essentially a forest of stakes, a bit like a palisade. So in fact, this tactic used by the Ottoman Turks was so well known, it's even represented in art of the time and was widely known. So there's many ways which Henry V could have heard about this tactic and decided to use it as an antidote to the French cavalry on the Agincourt campaign.
But moreover, there were also 1,000 English in that campaign fighting the Turks. And this included both men-at-arms and archers from Cheshire. If you're wondering which book I'm reading from, by the way, it's The Great Warbow by Matthew Strickland and Robert Hardy. Great book. Obviously, there's numerous primary sources, some of which contradict each other, which talk about these things. But anyway, there were some English on the campaign from Cheshire, archers and men-at-arms, and they were present at Nicopolis. And moreover, they were led by Henry IV's illegitimate brother. Now, Henry IV is some would say, usurper, so Henry V's dad, okay? So some of his dad's illegitimate brother, who was John of Beaufort, Earl of Somerset, they were his men. And the Earl John died in 1410, but as they say here, it's not hard to believe that he'd regaled his young nephew Henry with tales of the archers at Nicopolis. And I think that's completely plausible because Henry took a great interest in military strategy. He was very learned. He read lots of books. He also read lots of accounts of current affairs. And of course, he communicated with leaders all over Europe. So there's any number of ways he could have known about the Ottoman Turkish tactics that caused such a problem for the European knights at the Battle of Nicopolis. And of course, it wasn't necessarily the deciding factor, but we have to remember the Ottomans won. It was an Ottoman victory. And we should absolutely mention at this point that stakes used with archers by the English became a standard tactic after Agincourt. So they continued to be used right the way through the Hundred Years' War with France. They continued to be used English against English during the Wars of the Roses, for example, at the Battle of Blore Heath. But they were also used by English mercenaries who were sometimes fighting for foreign forces, for example, the Burgundians. So it was a standard feature of English longbowmen. And in fact, even still in the 16th century under Henry VIII, they were still using wooden stakes, so much so that Henry, when he went on campaign to France, took thousands of wooden stakes in wagons for the archers with them. So it was an intrinsic part of archer kind of strategy or tactics on the battlefield. The archers and the stakes went absolutely intrinsically together, and therefore you could say that apart from the longbow itself, or the warbow if you want to call it that, the stake was perhaps the second most important weapon of the English archer. And in fact, highlighting this point is an example in the Battle of Patay, where the English archers moved to a new position and they hadn't finished essentially putting their stakes up and their defensive works, and they were attacked by a relatively small force, maybe 150 to 200 French knights on horseback, and completely wiped out because they didn't have their defensive works in place. So the wooden stakes, not only were they incredibly effective, but when you didn't get them put in, it could be disastrous for the archers. And this is one of those things that we often use to display the fact that archers and archery wasn't the medieval machine gun. It didn't mow down knights. In fact, as you well know, armour is very good proof against most arrows, but you find gaps with lots of arrows and you hit horses and you hit less armoured people. And so archers are still very effective. But if they didn't have their defensive works, they were incredibly vulnerable to heavy cavalry charges. And Boucicaut knew this all the way back in 1415. But the wooden stakes, which he wasn't expecting, had been brought by Henry V's archers. So the final thing to consider is how were these wooden stakes actually used, deployed, moved? And the problem is we don't really know exactly. Now, we do have some artwork which show wooden stakes put in the ground. And we know that the Burgundians, for example, also copied that habit from the English. So we know, very loosely speaking, that obviously they were driven into the ground at about chest height for a horse. So midriff level, I would say, actually, midriff for a human or a horse. So clearly they're a good barrier against either humans or horses. But every single archer in Henry V's army had to carry a wooden stake. So let's say that there were 5,000 archers. That's 5,000 wooden stakes. The question is, how do we place them? Some people have argued that the wooden stakes, each one would be put in front of each archer. But the archers aren't standing all out in a long line. They're standing in some sort of formation. Whether it's a loose or a more regimented formation, we don't really know. So the question of how these were placed in the ground is as difficult to answer as how the archers were arranged, because we actually don't know how the archers were arranged. Now, there are certain terms which are used in the period sources, such as hearse and other things like that. Maybe I'll look at that in more detail in a future video. But the fundamental fact is that archers weren't necessarily all in one group. They were probably in separate groups. There were some which were probably with the men-at-arms in the middle, and there were some which were probably out on the flanks. So it's even possible that not all of the stakes were placed in the same way. It's possible that the archers on the flanks placed them all in a palisade in one front line, and it's possible that the archers in the centre, because you wanted to draw in the French forces into the centre where you could shoot them from the flanks, which we know that they did, it's possible that they were actually in more of a checkerboard formation. And so it's possible that the stakes went through the ranks, so that indeed if you moved forwards, and this is entirely possible that they did this, and this is a little pet theory of mine, having driven the stakes in here, we know that Henry's archers advanced to provoke the French, or at least it's mentioned in a couple of sources. Now, assuming that's the case, the question is, and again, Anne Curry and other historians writing about this period all disagree on this, they all have different theories. Some say that they pulled up the stakes and moved the stakes forward to a new line. That's possible, but it's also possible that what they actually did was left the stakes where they'd originally put them. They went forwards and shot a load of arrows at the French to provoke them to attack, and the stakes would have been hidden. Now, at that point, the French would attack with their cavalry to try and wipe out the archers, at which point the archers moved behind and, oh no, look what was behind me. Now, I personally, assuming they had this level of sort of thought and preemptiveness and planning, if they did, that would be a genius thing to do. Imagine if Henry V had gone, make lots of wooden stakes, drive them into the ground, but then all stand around them, because the enemy 300 yards over there won't be able to see the wooden stakes, and they'll go, archers, we'll charge them down. They start charging, at which point the archers move behind the wooden stakes and keep shooting at the horses incoming, and the wooden stakes are there essentially as a trap. So that would absolutely work. So you could use it as a surprise against cavalry, or you could use it as a deterrent. And obviously, if you want to do it as a deterrent, you want them out front so they can see, oh, well, we can't charge that because they've got wooden stakes. And so they don't even bother. But we know at Agincourt they did bother. We know that the cavalry did charge. So would they have charged if they'd known about the wooden stakes? I would say no, they would have flanked around. Anyway, this is all conjecture. We don't really know whether wooden stakes were put all dotted all around in an area, whether they were dotted around in front, whether they were put in a straight line like a palisade with the points pointing outwards in front. We don't really know. In much the same way as we don't really know the formation in which the archers were put. Now, I'm going to leave you with a final unknown, but invite you to post down below what you think. So one of the big questions for me as a sort of experimental archaeologist, living historian, reenactor, HEMA person, is how individual objects like axes and swords and bows are used. And when historians are writing about the 100 Years' War, they often consider big formations and logistics of supply and command and all of these sorts of things. But they don't necessarily think about, how do you make a wooden stake? Well, I've just demonstrated. It's easy. We know that archers had hatchets because they're mentioned in numerous sources, okay? We know that they had these, and you can easily, as I did there, sharpen a wooden stake good enough to go into a horse that's running with a small hatchet, okay? You don't need any more than that. That's fairly easy. The question now is, how do you drive it into the ground? Because assuming that it is a stake of this size, and admittedly they could have been thinner, they could have been more like sturdy halberd shafts or spear shafts, how do you drive that into the ground? This happened at a time of year when we know the ground was soft and wet and muddy, so that does make it easier. But how would you do it on a summer campaign? We know that English armies used these throughout the year, and usually campaigning, or very often campaigning, was in summer months when the ground is hard. How the hell do you drive that into the ground? Now, I've spent some of my life doing things that involve driving things into the ground, and I can tell you, even a large tent peg for a large tent is difficult to drive into very hard ground. How do you do it with that? In the modern world, you'd use some kind of pile driver usually, or a big sledgehammer, but even with a big sledgehammer, it'd be quite difficult. How did they do it? Is it the mauls? The mauls are mentioned. Yes, it's possible it's the large wooden mauls and they just use those. I would say probably, although I've made a fairly beefy stake, I suspect most of the stakes were actually smaller than this, which would make them easier to drive in. But the question is, how do you drive them in? Do you do it the same way you do with a large tent peg with a massive wooden maul? And are those the mauls that are being talked about being used as weapons? Quite possibly. Possibly they're different as the lead shod mauls we read about later, possibly the same, we don't know. But the secondary point is moving these. And if you've ever driven a large, like for a massive marquee, pin into the ground with a mallet, you'll know they're really difficult to get out. It's not something you can instantly do. And I think when we're talking about archers upping stakes, so to speak, is that where the expression comes from? When we're talking about them upping stakes and moving to a new position, we often talk about driving them in, but we don't talk about removing them. And actually removing a wooden stake out of the ground could be really difficult. So, how do you think they did it? How do you think the stakes were driven in? Do you think that they were pulled out and re-put in? I mean, I can even imagine some situations where it might literally be quicker to just cut a new stake and drive it in somewhere else rather than trying to get this stake out of the ground. Or maybe they just didn't drive them in very far into the ground. I don't know. Anyway, and you know, final thing I want to say is I have in the past said maybe they were driven in with hatchets. I think that would be very difficult because of the shape of the socket. You'd keep skidding off because it's pointed at this end, unless you point it afterwards, possibly. But Henry V apparently said to sharpen them at both ends. So I think difficult to drive in with this. I think you would need a specialised tool. Who did it? How did they do it? How did they move them? Answers down below, I don't know. Anyway, I have been Matt Easton. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope we'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.